Today in the EU, summit with focus on Iran's attack and EU's competitiveness. EU leaders are meeting in Brussels this week at the informal EU summit to tackle the Union's common reaction to Iran's attack on Israel and the bloc's competitiveness and economy. Hello and welcome. I am Evi Chiori, and this is Today in the EU. We sat down with Alexandra Brzozowski, Euractiv's Global Europe editor, and Thomas Moller-Nielsen, Euractiv's economy reporter, to discuss what can we expect from this upcoming summit. Alex, starting with you, this will be the last summit before the EU elections. What are the topics that we can expect?
Indeed, EU officials have been adamant to avoid the so-called Christmas tree approach to this summit, where usually you have discussions about everything and nothing and very long conclusions as well. But unfortunately, as it usually goes with a moving world agenda, that never works, does it? So initially, the plan was to make the summit about competitiveness and the economy, but realistically, after Iran's attack against Israel this weekend, EU leaders will be expected to have at least a discussion on how to avoid a wider escalation in the region. As far as we understand, they will also specifically talk about Lebanon.
So there is a lot there. How can we rate the EU's reaction so far? And is there something specific that we can expect from this EU summit?
So besides the relative unison condemnation of Iran's attack and calls for restraints against Israel to not retaliate against Tehran, European diplomats and officials have started using diplomatic pressure channels with Iran. We've seen quite a bit of phone diplomacy since Sunday, especially between Brussels, Berlin, Paris with Tehran. We're also looking towards an extraordinary Foreign Affairs Council via VTC this afternoon, where member states are expected to dive deeper into what can be done to sanction Iran. At the moment, there's two different avenues they're looking at, which on the one side is more listings and persons and companies of what is actually already done until now. So this could also include the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, and which, there was an idea to maybe designate them as a terrorist organization. So this is all included into that track. And on the other, as European Commission President von der Leyen already suggested on Sunday as well, it's looking into sanctions on Iran's drone and missile programs.
Iran's actions risk provoking an uncontrollable regional escalation, and this has to be avoided. Going forward, we will reflect on additional sanctions against Iran in close cooperation with our partners, specifically on its drone and missile programs.
So the one thing about that is that, on the other hand, what has gone unnoticed over the weekend a bit is that obviously there was also an attack on Ukraine with drones and missiles. So this could be having a double impact, and it would limit Iran's capacities to send more drones to Russia for its war in Ukraine as well.
Another topic that might gather some interest is the threat of foreign interference, especially in the light of the Russia Gate. What can we expect on this?
Indeed, with less than 2 months to go until the EU elections, Belgian Prime Minister De Croo has requested to have a discussion with leaders on foreign interference and how to counter it. This comes obviously after Belgium's federal prosecutors launched an investigation against members of the European Parliament allegedly paid by Moscow, the so-called Russia Gate, as we have named it now. The European Parliament leadership and political groups have started proposing actions to double down on the security. But despite the reforms undertaken since Qatargate, we have not seen much of an impact of that, right? So the shady workings seem to be going on no matter what was put in place after Qatargate. So in general, we can expect this topic might become more heated towards the polls. But the main question that comes with that, of course, is whether European institutions and member states have enough tools to combat that. And one of the ideas that also has been put forward by De Croo is maybe to expand the mandate of EU's public prosecutor and the EU anti-fraud office to allow prosecuting foreign interference and disinformation. But on that, I think we can expect a relatively open debate with unclear yet whether there will be any outcomes.
Now, the main topic of this summit will be the EU's competitiveness. So, Tom, coming to you, what can we expect on this front and why is the summit happening now?
It's probably quite important just to take a step back and understand why this conference is happening now. So the conference is happening at a time when Europe is really experiencing quite serious economic problems. So at the risk of overwhelming the listeners with figures, I have a few that I've written down right now. So this is just GDP growth for Europe, the US, Russia and China for last year and the projections for this year. And
How does it look?
Not too good, actually. And obviously GDP growth is quite a crude kind of estimate of how an economy is doing, but still it does provide quite a lot of information. It gives you a rough idea of how economies tend to do. So last year, according to the IMF, the US economy grew by 2.5%. Russia grew by 3%, China grew by 5.2%, the Eurozone grew by 0.5%, which means that last year, Europe grew 5 times slower than the US, 6 times slower than Russia, and more than 10 times slower than China.
And this year?
This year, it's still pretty bad. It's slightly better than last year. But so again, according to the IMF's most recent projections, the US is set to grow by 2.1%. Russia by 2.6% and China by 4.6%. Europe is projected to grow 0.9%. So only 2 times slower than the United States and roughly 3 times slower than Russia. And if my maths still serves me right, about 5 times slower than China. But however, the IMF has new projections that are being published. Since these projections were published in January, Germany, Europe's largest economy and the industrial powerhouse of the bloc, has downgraded its projected growth this year from 1.3% to 0.2%, which means that probably these figures are going to look a lot worse. Basically, Europe's economy is really not doing very, very well.
And what are the reasons for that?
I think a useful place to start with it is with this very interesting speech that Josep Borrell, the EU's top diplomat, gave in October last year, where he said that Europe's prosperity in recent years was based on 2 things. So number 1, cheap energy from Russia, and number 2, trade with China, both in terms of imports and exports. Now, obviously, since Russia's invasion, Europe's imports of Russian energy have declined quite significantly, not to zero, but declined quite significantly. Europe's trade with China hasn't declined to the same extent, but it is declining in certain specific sectors. And this is because, as we've spoken about in a previous podcast,
indeed, go give that episode a listen.
Europe is de-risking from China, so cutting trade in certain strategic sectors. But China is also de-risking from Europe for similar reasons, really, for security reasons.
And more specifically?
There are 2 other important factors as well that are worth mentioning. So one other one is industrial policy, both in China and the United States. And this is impacting Europe's competitiveness in, I guess, 2 main ways. So one is China is producing loads and loads and loads of high-tech products, in particular solar panels and electric vehicles, which are, number 1, high quality, and number 2, very cheap. And Europe is really struggling to compete with this. There are all these concerns, you might have read it in the media, about China dumping all these products on European markets. Europe is basically struggling to keep up with that. On the other hand, in America, they've passed this Inflation Reduction Act, and it provides billions and billions and billions, perhaps even trillions of dollars in subsidies to basically encourage companies to produce green products, so to speak, like electric vehicles in the United States. And this is encouraging a lot of European companies to move to America. And then the final thing I'll mention is monetary policy. So after Russia's invasion, what happened was there was massive inflation crisis in Europe. Inflation peaked in the Eurozone at 10.6%. In response to this, the European Central Bank raised interest rates, which is kind of the standard thing that European central banks do when there's high inflation. And this has basically suppressed demand. It's limited companies' abilities to take out loans. It's made it much harder to invest.
So what is the plan now?
The European Central Bank was expected to cut rates in June prior to what happened over the weekend with regard to Iran and Israel. Long-term, most analysts think that the European Central Bank will probably cut rates to, right now it's at a record high of 4%. It was at minus 0.5% prior to Russia's invasion. Most analysts think it'll probably level off at around about 2%. The danger of the current crisis in the Middle East is that this will lead to a spike in oil prices, which then could feed into wider inflation and basically cause resurgence inflation, which means that the European Central Bank will have to keep higher rates at a higher level for longer. And this would impact Europe's economy. There was a very interesting speech by a top European Central Bank official last month where he said European Central Bank's policy is going to hamper have a negative impact on Europe's growth until 2026 if this crisis in the Middle East, gets worse or persists. It's very likely that the European Central Bank's policy is going to have a negative impact on Europe's growth for longer. So basically, all of this is to say there are several reasons why Europe is really facing a real crisis in its competitiveness right now. So in terms of trade, in terms of industrial policy in China and America, and in terms of monetary policy.
And you mentioned that today the predictions of the bloc's economy will be coming out. Would you say that this will shift the focus of the summit? Do you think that EU leaders are now realizing that this is a problem and will focus on what the discussion can be to actually solve this?
Might well have an impact on the summit. I mean, IMF's projections are usually watched quite closely. There are usually quite significant shifts in their projections. If I remember correctly, at the last projection in January, they upgraded Russia's projected growth by, I think it was 1.5 or 1.6 percentage points. Part of the reason for this is we live in a time of real geopolitical uncertainty where, projections are subject to change. They will still focus on competitiveness. Obviously, ministers are going to be discussing the current crisis in the Middle East. That's perfectly understandable given the fact that there's a real potential for a Third World War, a regional war breaking out. But in terms of the competitiveness part of the council and what they'll be focusing on, I don't think that'll shift the kind of overall focus. And I think if you look at, so we've got our hands on these EUCO, as they're called, European Council draft conclusions. The main thing to really take away from this is there's a big emphasis on, I would say, integrating Europe's single market. So basically allowing goods, services, people and capital to move more freely across the bloc. There's one line about the need to encourage investments, both public and private investments, to facilitate the green and digital transitions. But there's a big emphasis on getting the private sector, on getting companies to make Europe more competitive. They mention at least several times the need to remove barriers. They talk about the need to reduce companies' administrative burden. They talk about, this is a little bit technical, but when they're talking about the European securitization market, they talk about the need to make regulatory and prudential changes. Probably that means cutting regulations. But the main focus, basically Europe's response to all of these kind of broader geopolitical forces that are making it less competitive, is integrate the single market and basically leverage the power of private capital and the invisible hand of the market, so to speak. And the idea is, or the hope is, that this is what's going to make Europe more competitive ultimately.
Much of the talk has been directed towards these two reports by Mario Draghi and Enrico Letta that could be discussed. What are we talking about exactly?
But I personally get the impression that a lot of people are they're pinning a lot of hopes on these reports. They say, well, when we get these reports from Letta and Draghi, then we will know what to do. It's like Moses coming down the mountain. They're gonna have the answers to all our problems. Letta, I think it's already fairly clear what it is that he's going to say, and it's also quite similar, I would say, to what European leaders are calling for, which is integrating the single market. He talks about integrating the market for energy, financial services, and telecoms. That's really the main focus, basically. Leveraging the power of the single market, that's how Europe is going to become more competitive. The Letta report will be presented to ministers on Wednesday. The Draghi report will come out in the end of June. That's on competitiveness. Probably it would make more sense if Draghi's report was presented here, given that it's on competitiveness rather than the single market. But obviously the single market is related to competitiveness. The reason why Draghi's report is coming out in June is because there were fears that it would be highly political, because he's saying there's massive investments that have to be made, including public investments. And people regard that as, politically sensitive thing to say. So his report has been delayed. It's coming out at the end of June. I think we know a little bit less about what that's going to contain, but he's already said we need billions and billions and billions. I think it's around 500 billion extra annually, of 500 billion euros extra annually in investments to facilitate the green and digital transitions and basically make Europe a more competitive place for businesses.
So what do you think we will end up seeing after the summit?
A lot of emphasis, a lot of talk about what the single market has been able to achieve for Europe and its potential going forward. There are so many things or potential criticisms that could be made of European policymakers' proposals here. I would say one, so when it comes to, for instance, integrating the single market for capital, there's been a lot of talk about what's the so-called capital markets union, basically making it more easy for capital and funds to move across borders.
Wait, what is that?
This has been an idea that's been around for more than a decade, and basically there have been very few developments in that regard. over the last 10 years. There have been some, but not really that many.
Mm-hmm.
There was an interesting report published by the European Central Bank about a month ago where they said, look, when it comes to the capital markets union, the expression they used was there's no low-hanging fruit left, basically, which means that so far the only developments that have been made have been ones that are relatively easy. Mm-hmm. Going forward, it's going to require member states to kind of give up more sovereignty when it comes to like financial regulation and things like that. And these are politically much more sensitive issues.
Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Thomas, for sharing with us your insights on this upcoming summit. I am Evi Chiori, and this was Euractiv's Today in the EU podcast. Visit Euractiv to stay on top of the latest news, sign up for our podcast newsletter. If you haven't subscribed or followed us yet, you can find us on all streaming platforms. Also, make sure to leave a review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Your reviews help us spread the word about our content. This episode was produced by Nicoletta Ionta and myself. Thank you for tuning in. We will be back tomorrow. As part of our commitment to accuracy, inclusion and transparency, Euractiv is part of the Trust Project.